Imagine the scene: 30 men and women locked in a conference room for hours on end. There's free coffee, catered food, and beverages of all kinds. Their meetings, which started in October 2001, took place in the evenings in a nondescript building called the Institute for Creative Technology on a quiet street in the Los Angeles area. The assembled screenwriters, directors, and producers were drawn from the movie world's best ranks. Their task was to imagine plausible ways in which terrorists would launch new attacks against the United States in the wake of September 11, 2001. Asymmetrical warfare had enacted in the physical world had been perfected. The United States had been caught completely by surprise and rendered helpless by people who are manifestly more creative than we are. On July 1st, 2021, the National Security Agency announced that Russian military intelligence units were continuing their brute force worldwide hacking campaigns. The campaigns of cyber attacks have targeted our government, military, political parties, defense contractors, energy companies, universities, law firms, and media outlets, according to the NSA. And this, of course, is on the heels of the massive SolarWinds cybersecurity attack, unnoticed for many months, that infiltrated some of the most secure computer networks on this planet. The list of bad players in this realm includes Chinese, Iranian, and North Korean governments, as well as other non-government entities. Cyber attacks are defined as an act of war because, as has been demonstrated, the consequences to our lives can be very damaging. Asymmetrical warfare enacted in the cyber world has been perfected. And the United States, again, has been caught completely by surprise and rendered helpless by people who are manifestly more creative than we are. Of course, these are examples of human-made disasters. Certainly acts of war, cyber, or otherwise are extremely disruptive. It's not difficult to list the many ways nature can wreak havoc on our planet and our lives. Statistics show that the frequency and severity of what are termed as natural disasters is increasing dramatically. And I can assure you that powerful alien lasers do not cause California forest fires. However, I can also assure you that global climate disruption is an important reason for devastating fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, extreme heat waves, and a host of other calamities. In addition, the consequences of human encroachment upon habitats and ecosystems we have previously not disturbed present a double jeopardy. Harmful pathogens are being released that we have no defense for, and there is further climate disruption. All of these problems are largely aided by human activity and human inactivity. We apparently have not been evolutionarily gifted with the capacity to grasp the damage we do to complex systems over time, nor do we apparently have the will to correct our mistakes. I describe all this mayhem to make a point: that for the first time in our existence as a species on this planet, we are entering a phase of chronic disruption that is of our own making. That is the stark, brutal, and clear reality that we must come to grips with, whether we like it or not. Since mid-2019, I've been involved in a deep study of what I call Church 2.0. The focus has been on how organized religion needs to adapt to the challenges of the future. And then the COVID-19 pandemic appeared to place an exclamation point on my work. It has fundamentally changed the way all religious organizations offer spiritually centered services. The Church 2.0 project is intended to inform, prepare, and equip religious organizations to meet spiritual needs in a time of chronic and ongoing crisis. We all know that many denominations transition to online delivery of pastoral and administrative services. The focus for many churches is on restoring the status quo. Consequently, further challenges, such as the many effects of climate disruption, possibility of other pandemics, social unrest, deep political division, and the possibility of economic collapse in many sectors has not generally been planned for. And that's because many people have not recognized that the post-March 2020 world is fundamentally and permanently changed. So all this activity begs the question, what is the status quo? I would argue this term is misleading, and it has the effect of blinding us to reality. Status quo generally is interpreted as something that is normal or unchanging. But these days, especially after we've been so rocked by COVID-19, we desperately seek the comfort of the familiar. We want to go back to movie theaters. We want more 4th of July good stuff. And we want to worship in our pews again, surrounded by our church family. That's all fine. But it's not the status quo, is it? The definition of status quo is the existing state of affairs. I remind you that the existing state of affairs is that COVID-19 is not done with humanity as of this moment. Worldwide, 184 million people have contracted COVID, and nearly 4 million have died from it. Over 700,000 people in the United States alone have died from COVID. At this moment, populations of the unvaccinated in our country are at great risk of dying from more virulent strains of COVID, such as the so-called Delta variant. Our evolutionary limitations are literally killing us. While many unvaccinated go blithely along believing that luck or willpower will save them from COVID, others who are vaccinated ignore warnings about the need to exercise precautions in crowded spaces. So the status quo is actually a state of flux, change, disruption, chronic crisis, and uncertainty. And it should be clear that the notion of returning to some ideal status quo is a dangerous myth. And this is the place in the sermon where my good friend, the Reverend Ben Myers, would say to me, now, Clovice, you've got to give the congregant some good news, some solution, and some hope after all that doom and gloom. Well, my dear friends, there is some good news in all this chaos. I imagine you've heard the phrase, may you live in interesting times. This is an English expression that purports to be a translation of a traditional Chinese curse. Well, seemingly a blessing, the expression is normally used ironically. Life is better in uninteresting times of peace and tranquility than in interesting times, which are usually times of trouble. Despite being so common in English as to be known as the Chinese curse, turns out there's no known equivalent expression in Chinese. The nearest related Chinese expression translates as, better to be a dog in times of tranquility than a human in times of chaos. So there you have it. Now, it is true that we do live in interesting times. That statement is ironic and literal, factual and allegorical, neatly wrapped up into an all-inclusive ball of quantum possibilities. With everything that is happening, it is easy to feel overwhelmed. It's easy to feel like everything that anchors us to this reality is being swept away. But the fact is, we don't need to feel overwhelmed. And reality isn't being swept away. What we need to do is breathe and then find ways to take care of ourselves. We'll all get through this time of medical, racial, societal, and environmental upheaval. We will heal and we will grow. And that is the interesting times way of the world. Many of us do not consider ourselves as religious, but rather as spiritual. We prefer to think that a more humanist-oriented, rational, and scientific approach to our problems will reveal the solution. And I'd argue we've tried all that, but we failed. And as I said earlier, we don't seem to be evolutionarily capable of, or even genetically disposed towards recognizing such enormous and complex problems in time to save ourselves, or at least get back to the status quo we now so desperately wish for. So what do we do? As far as solutions to the uncertainty and disruption that will be a constant feature of our lives is concerned, the most important thing to do is to take control of what we have control over. The second thing to do is to be creative. The third thing to do is to rely on each other for help. And lastly, we must see the spiritual significance of living in a way that encourages sacrifice and service to both our planet and our children. This is, of course, a deeply spiritual component. There is this component, the spirituality to all of this. Churches need to model the behavior of having faith, forbearance, and steadfastness that we encourage in individuals who are faced with loss and uncertainty. Put simply, churches need to plan for, respond to, and persevere through these uncertain times. This is the first thing to do. Church leaders need to imagine the worst case scenario and work backwards from there. Here in California, there is no excuse for any church to not have a robust, up-to-date, and comprehensive preparedness plan for fires, floods, earthquakes, and civil and economic disruption. Believe it or not, one of the best documents I've researched for the Church 2.0 project is a FEMA publication from June 2013 entitled Guide for Developing High-Quality Emergency Operations Plans for Houses of Worship. Get it? This document covers everything from planning principles, content, threat assessment, to how to deal with active shooter incidents. The second thing I believe is essential to taking control, as I said, is creativity. I'm talking about instituting an ongoing process that allows everyone to participate in imagining creative solutions to challenges that might arise. Pore over preparedness documents from other churches and even other denominations. There's really good information out there. Modify it for your own needs, but don't limit yourself to what has ever existed before. Do like the Hollywood writers I talked about earlier, and imagine the unimaginable. The third admonition seems like a no-brainer, but it will be quite difficult. When I say that congregations need to rely on everyone to imagine creative solutions to a world we find it difficult to imagine, and then to plan for that, I also urge you to include children and young adults. Don't think for a moment that most of them have not thought about the future we adults will be leaving them. The future world will not be of their making. So the greatest gift we can provide them with is the ability to make a difference. Listen to them. Seek their advice. For Christ's sake, let them scan the millions of pages of paper documents your congregation is probably still holding on to. Let them dream up ways to communicate without electricity. Ask them what they will need in the future that we will not inhabit, and then work backwards from there to provide for them. And this brings us to the fourth and last point about the spiritual significance of living in a way that encourages sacrifice and service to both our planet and our children. The fact is that we boomers have screwed up. We need to own that and move forward. Our children may not be able to articulate yet their loss, their grief, and possibly anger at us for our errors. This is a time for both humility and forgiveness. We may not be evolutionarily capable of getting out of our own way, but we can hope that future generations will be smarter and be able to work with far fewer resources than we presently have. Living in a way that encourages sacrifice and service to both our planet and our children is the greatest spiritual challenge of our age. Now I'm reminded of the saying that there are no atheists in a foxhole. Whether we wish to acknowledge this or not, we are responsible to our planet, which is a living entity with rights that we have abused. We have abused the rights of unborn generations of human beings to come, and we have abused the rights of all living creatures on Earth. This is an indictment I raise, particularly to those of us who do not believe in a God with a personality. Others have an out. They can point to a sinful, fallen nature and expect merciful miracles to save us from ourselves. Some of us pride ourselves on action for social and environmental justice, but we can do all that from our living rooms, enabled by our checkbooks. My challenge to all of us is to reach deep down to where our guilt lives, and then extract from that place our own forgiveness. If you're in this foxhole without a deep set of beliefs or convictions, then I encourage you to look into the only book of life that matters. That book is our set of genetic instructions encoded into our DNA. Fear, guilt, trauma, and anxiety. Those are all transmitted to our future generations epigenetically. What do you wish to leave them? Will you leave them fairy tales and denial? Or will you transmit the clear-eyed purpose of sacrifice and service? Are you willing to sacrifice your energies, your wealth, your conveniences, and your way of life to ensure a hope for a future life on this planet? Are you willing to serve others in need now and in the future? As I said earlier, all these problems that characterize the contours of a bleak future are largely aided by human activity and human inactivity. Now, from this larger perspective, I repeat that for the first time in our existence as a species on this planet, we are entering a phase of chronic disruption that is of our own making. My dear friends, the fact is that forgiveness will need to be the spiritual and psychic bedrock of the church of the future. We must absolve ourselves to ourselves, as Emerson put it. We must rise above the debilitating guilt most of us have not yet acknowledged. If we can't step out of the way of our evolutionary ineptitude, then we can at least work to correct that fault. If we can't see the future of climate disruption, then look deeply into the eyes of young people everywhere. Weep for them, and then act. If you're not sure of what to do next, then organize with your friends and this church. Put your heads together. Love, feel, grow, sacrifice. Allow compassion to guide you. Do you know what Church 2.0 will look like? It will look like a living organism that is not confined by walls. Its heartbeat will be justice, and its blood will be compassion. Its body will be the hearts and minds of all people who wish to live in harmony with each other and our mother planet. The new church will discard false hopes and hollow doctrines of the past to embrace the fire of commitment to a future fueled by love. So, do you want to recreate the old status quo church you're familiar with? Or do you want to build something entirely new? I know where I'm going. I know what I'm going to do. What are you going to do?